Did it, the books, the bid it, the books, the did it, the books, books.
All right, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. Today, uh, this is a bit of a shop the shelf update, but it's also a hey, what did I find when I went to the store? Because yes, I did go to the bookstore, and no, to answer your question, uh, I did not truthfully buy these books. I also didn't steal them. I didn't steal them. I mentioned in one of the previous videos that I and my brothers have a holiday in which we celebrate our brotherhood, and one of my brothers got me a gift card. So I went and made what I think you'll agree by the time this is over was pretty good use of that gift card. And I was getting rid of some dog-eared pages that I just noticed in this book that I'm about to show you while I was explaining that, which is why I was looking down. Yeah. So all of these, I think I spent $2, like bought these, and then one of them, put me just over the top, so it was $2. But gift card is what these are. So these all came from that. So I'm going to show you what they are, and then I'll tell you where it puts me in my struggles. So the first one I bought, not because I've read a lot of John Grisham, but because this is one of the movies that I've seen based on his work, and that is The Firm. Obviously this book is relatively old, um, and the movie is one of the several John Grisham adaptations that I've seen. Um, I've seen a lot of John Grisham adaptations, but it's one of the ones that like sticks out to me. The other one that sticks out to me, which I also have, I'm actually looking at right now over there on the shelf, is A Time to Kill. I really liked that movie. I enjoyed The Firm. This book was $1, and I was kind of like, the movie was good enough that for $1, the book probably is going to be good enough. Um, John Grisham wouldn't be able to keep writing if he wasn't, at least decently good. Also, get that author picture. He looks. I can't. That's hilarious. Man, the things you find in books. Um, So, if you don't know, The Firm is about a young man named Mitch McDear who joins a law firm right out of law school. And it seems like this really sweet gig. They're paying off his student loans and they've got him a car and they've set him up in this nice house. And then they start to ask him to do things. And he doesn't like the things they ask him to do. And so the question becomes, can I get out or not? So I'm sure it will be a different experience reading it, knowing how it ends. But like a lot of books that I read that I've seen the movie of, I bet there are things that are going to be different, number one. And then number two, it's been long enough that I'll probably have forgotten some major plot points. And so I fully expect to be surprised by The Firm. Have no doubt that I'll be surprised at some point. So the next one, I had forgotten there was a book of this, but that is MASH by Richard Hooker. Um, so I grew up, my parents were big fans of the television show, which was inspired by this book. And so I have seen a great many episodes of MASH. I have watched the series finale, um, which I think people of my generation are unlikely to have done that. But it's a great show. In particular, love Alan Alda in that show. He's great. But that show also does a lot of really great things because at the time it was filmed, America was fighting the Vietnam conflict. It asks a lot of really uncomfortable questions about war and shows a lot of really uncomfortable truths about war. And so it's a great show. and I am excited to read the book. I already know that it's somewhat different. It's compared on the back to Catch 22, which in my book is actually my book is not a good thing because Catch 22, it was written in a very specific way, but I hated reading Catch 22. So I'm hoping that when they compare it to Catch 22, it just means it's a good anti-war book, not it's so strangely written as to be almost incomprehensible. Um, well, we'll find out. I don't know. But love the television show, so I'm hoping the book is on par. We'll see. Um, the next one I picked up because I've been reading. If you've been watching the channel, I've been reading some sword and sorcery, and this book sounded effectively sounded like sword and sorcery that was written in like the 16th or the 14th century. This is Grettir's Saga, which is a Norse saga. I'll just read part of the back because it says it better than I could. A sweeping epic of the Viking Age. Grettir's Saga follows the life of the outlaw Grettir the Strong as he battles against sorcery, bad luck, and the vengefulness of his enemies. Feared by many, Grettir is a warrior and also a poet and a lover who is afraid of the dark. Unable to resolve the dispute that has outlawed him, he lives outside the bounds of family life, roams the countryside, ridding Iceland and Norway of berserker warriors, trolls, and the walking dead. Awesome. Yeah, and so I read that and I was like, well, that sounds like stuff that I already read. And so I could not pass it up. Oh, man. It's got maps with battles and stuff. Gosh, yeah, this is gonna be pictures. You love a prose book with pictures. Um, Even adults like picture books, man. Yeah, diagrams. Love a good diagram. Yeah, excellent. So, yeah, I have a couple Norse sagas in hallway in another bookshelf, and so there will probably be a period of my life where I read like three of these at once. Um, but yeah, this just sounded almost exactly like the books that I've been reading, the sword and sorcery books I've been reading. And so I was like, well, I guess people have been enjoying that for centuries. Part of a club. So there you go. Grettir's Saga. I don't think it's, I think the author's anonymous. So I don't know who that's by. But I do know who this is by. This is an ecclesiastical history of the English people by the Venerable Bede. You might be wondering what's going on here. This is known as cover clipping, and this is done on, I think, typically books that are used as textbooks at a collegiate level, so that they basically only go from the school bookstore to students and then back to the school bookstore. Back when collegiate bookstores still stocked books instead of just apparel. Looking at you, University of Kentucky. Um, but this is like a seminal work of early English history. It was written in the 8th century AD. And essentially it covers the history of Britain up to that point. And it calls it an ecclesiastical history, but ecclesiastical history in the sense of what's been going on regarding Christianity. And so there are, things in this book which touch on regular English life. There's the story of, what's his name? I'm going to forget right in the clutch. He's an English king, the king of Mercia, and his soldiers, and he performed a miracle right before he died in battle fighting pagans from Wales. And so, like it depicts English life and English political history, but it does it specifically through the lens of the church. The Bede was, I think, he was a monk. Don't recall exactly. Um, Yeah, I think he's a monk. But this is, yeah, this is just a seminal work of English history. It's a book that I've wanted to read for a really long time. When I picked it up, I was like, oh, I'm not going to get that because I already have that. And then I was like, oh, no, I don't. I looked at my list and I was like, oh, I actually don't have that. So, cool. There's a page in here about the life of Chad and the death of Chad. Awesome. Chad. So looking forward to that. Gosh, I wish I could remember that guy's name. Guys, they all die, obviously, because this is from 1,000 years ago. But yeah, it's a seminal work of English history, and looking forward to reading that. Bede is, as the back of this book will tell you, the father, or known as the father of English history. This is the earliest chronicle, I think, of English people, which calls them English, I believe. That was a relatively new term in the 8th century. And so Bede, I think, is the first person who recognizes the English as a distinct people, because the island of Britain was subject to a lot of immigration as the Western Roman Empire kind of collapsed in the 3rd and 4th centuries and into the 5th century AD. And the people who lived there were driven out or mixed with or subjugated by immigrating peoples like the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons. And so those three people in particular, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, they came to England. The Danes and some other people from Scandinavia came over, and the mixture of those people um, created modern English people. So a lot going on there. But by the 8th century, they actually thought of themselves, in some sense, some people thought of themselves as English. So looking forward to that one a lot. Got three more, and then we'll be done. I'll talk about where I'm at shop the shelf wise. I'd actually looked at this one before. But it was right at the time when I was beginning my shop the shelf challenge, and I wasn't buying books. Still technically haven't. But this is Hannibal's Road, the Second Punic War in Italy by Mike Roberts. Hannibal is one of those figures from the ancient world that I think people might know the name of, even if they don't really know anything about him or anything about the ancient world. So to give you the long and the short of it, Hannibal, which I think that's him, or it's supposed to be him. I don't think it's actually a statue of him. And I'm not going to be able to figure it out very quickly. But Hannibal was an officer, a general for the ancient city-state of Carthage in North Africa. And the Carthaginian Empire and the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire, when it was still technically a republic, they came to blows for a variety of reasons. In the 200s BC, and they fought a massive, primarily naval conflict over the island of Sicily and some of the surrounding islands, which is called the First Punic War. And then they fought another massive war over control primarily of Spain and parts of North Africa and Gaul. So it's the Second Punic War. And Hannibal was the primary Carthaginian general during the Second Punic War, and quite famously marched across the Alps in winter with a group of elephants. And that's usually understood to be one of his more famous feats. Bringing an ancient army across a barrier like the Alps is pretty impressive. He was fighting part of the time too. The local peoples did not particularly like him coming through. I think probably because he was eating a lot of food. His like 40,000 men were eating a lot of food, as well as their horses and their like 20 elephants. Probably eat a lot of food. But he was trying to get into Italy because essentially what he thought he could do is if he could get into Italy and begin attacking the Romans in their own heartland, he might be able to separate some of their allied peoples in northern Italy and southern Italy from the Romans and then maybe possibly lay siege to Rome itself. And so he, between 213 and 203 BC, he marches across the Alps into Italy, and he hands the Romans three of the worst defeats in their history in 3 years. The first one is the Battle of is it Trasimene? Maybe not. The first one I think is the Battle of the River Trebia, where he lures a Roman army across a freezing river in very early morning when they haven't eaten breakfast, and then Hannibal's army, just collapses on them and basically wipes them out. I think there are 25,000 Roman casualties at Trebia. And then he lures another Roman army out to fight him at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, which I think is the same year, like within the same 6 months, and leads them into a trap and falls on them on the lakeside. And there's 15,000 Roman casualties at Trasimene. And then fights a long campaign, and a couple of years later, um, draws out the largest single Roman army, I think, ever to have been brought together, um, to a battlefield in southern Italy called Cannae. Um, and accounts differ and historians differ, but somewhere between 70 and 90,000 Romans and Roman allies, against a much smaller Carthaginian force. I think there are 50,000 Carthaginians and allies. I don't remember exactly, but much smaller. And Hannibal, again, draws the enemy into a trap. His forces essentially collapse around the Romans. And again, accounts differ, but the most common number that you'll hear, casualty wise, for the Battle of Cannae is 70,000 Romans and Roman allies are killed on the field at the Battle of Cannae. Some of the primary sources about Cannae say that the Carthaginians have the Romans pressed so close together that the Romans can't lift their arms to use their weapons, and that the Carthaginians have to, at times, just take a break for a minute because they've killed so many Romans that their arms are essentially too tired to keep killing. Um, yeah, just, yeah. And so Hannibal is able, for a decade, 213 to 203 BC, Hannibal is able to sustain a war in Italy against the Romans for 10 years, uh, without being caught with his back against a wall and having his army destroyed. He's able to hand the Romans three of the worst defeats in their history, certainly up to that point, but even after. Three of the worst defeats in Roman history are Trasimene, Trebia, and Cannae. Cannae is the worst, I think, pretty much hands down. But the other two are really bad. And he does that all without ever being defeated. The Romans are never able to defeat him in Italy. The only reason that Hannibal is forced to stop is because the Romans send Scipio, a man named Scipio, to Spain, where he wipes out the forces of Hannibal's brother and some of his other relatives. And then Scipio says, well, what if we just invaded Africa and forced him to come back? And that's what they do. And Hannibal and his troops sail back to Africa and fight the Battle of Zama in 202, I think it is, 202 BC. And the only reason I would suggest that Hannibal loses the Battle of Zama, which he does, is because the Romans were able to detach one of Carthage's principal allies, which was the kingdom of Numidia. The Numidians have fantastic cavalry, and Numidian cavalry is one of the reasons, among many, but one of the reasons why Hannibal was able to hand the Romans these horrible defeats. At the Battle of Zama, the Numidians are on the other side. And if you read the accounts of the battle, or if you study it, then what you find is that the reason that Hannibal loses, and the reason Hannibal wins in his battles in Italy, is because of his cavalry. When the Numidians were on his side, he was able to carry out these wild and crazy plans and encircle and destroy the Romans. At Zama, the opposite of that basically happens to him. The Numidians are on the other side. His cavalry is not that great. They get driven from the field, and then his infantry and the Roman infantry basically just have a death match for most of the day until the Roman cavalry and the Numidian cavalry return to the battlefield and hit his troops in the rear, and that's when he loses the battle and he rides back to Carthage. Um, and so this book chronicles the period of his ascendancy in Italy. It's just victory after victory. Um, but he's never able to actually besiege Rome. There's an apocryphal quotation by the king of the Numidians after the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal's being urged to march on the city of Rome, and he says, "No, we don't have any siege equipment. We can't take Rome." And or maybe it's his cousin. I think it's his cousin Maharbal, who says, Hannibal, you know how to win a victory, but not how to use it. Um, and although that quotation is apocryphal, I think it does speak pretty well to what ultimately happens to the Carthaginian war effort in the Second Punic War, because, yeah, he wins these three major victories, just absolutely wipes out Roman armies. At the Trebia, there is no more Roman army. At Trasimene, some guys get away. At Cannae, some guys get away. But he wipes out multiple Roman armies. I mean, at Cannae, he wipes out the better part of, well, when you think about the fact that at this time period, 10,000 men is a Roman army, at Trebia, he wipes out three Roman armies. At Trasimene, he wipes out one and a half. And at Cannae, he wipes out seven. So it's 7 to 9, depending on who you read and who you listen to. So like he wins victories, but he's never able to bring the Romans to heel. The Romans are willing to accept all these losses, and the Carthaginians just aren't. And they never resupply Hannibal in Italy. I don't think they're able to, but they never manage to, regardless. Um, and so he wins these massive victories, but they never really amount to anything. And Carthage ultimately lost the First Punic War, loses the Second Punic War, and then about 80 years later will be drawn into and then lose the Third Punic War, at which point Carthage itself ceases to exist. So um, it'll be a really interesting book, because most of the time the story you get about Hannibal's campaigns is from the classical sources, which are mostly Roman. There are no Carthaginian sources, unfortunately. It'd be really interesting to get their perspective, but they lost, so they don't get to say anything because they're all dead. So a lot of Roman sources, some non-Roman sources, but they're kind of trying not to make the Romans mad, so you really don't get anything other than Roman perspectives. Um, and so you probably miss some very important context and some very important perspective from the other side. But enough about that. Obviously, I'm pretty passionate about that. Enough about that, and on to something else that I'm passionate about. This is Richard and John, Kings at War by Frank McLynn. The Richard and John in question are Richard the Lionheart, Richard the Second, the Lionheart of England, and his brother John Lackland, who's the wicked bad guy in Robin Hood. Um, and McLynn is actually the author of another biography that I have of Marcus Aurelius. So I think he's just one of those serial biographers rather than a student of the period itself. But um, both of these guys were soldiers. Um, John a little less than Richard. Richard was known as a soldier king. John was sort of forced into it. But I think he makes the argument in this book that John was actually more of a soldier than most people give him credit for. John gets a real bad rap. Yeah, I do. John Lackland gets a real bad rap. Mostly, I think, because of Robin Hood. That's the only reason anybody knows anything about him. He was a bit of a terrible person. Um, Even at the time, people were like, yeah, we don't really like him. But that eclipses in much of the discussion of John, that eclipses a lot of things that he does to actually attempt to preserve the Plantagenet Empire, which is his family, the Plantagenets. He does attempt, he goes to war in France to preserve the Plantagenet Empire. He just loses. And so history is kind of colored by that fact that he very much loses. But, people like Richard the Lionheart, but they forget that he doesn't win the Third Crusade. He basically makes a truce, which doesn't mean much of anything, after kind of winning one battle. And then he returns to Europe, spends a bunch of time in prison, and then goes to fight in northern France and gets shot by a cook, I think, with a crossbow. And that's how Richard the Lionheart, the great soldier king of England, dies, is by being shot by a cook. So, you know, there's context to be had for both of them. But really interested to read this. I've read some stuff about Richard before, not really anything about John. So looking forward to tackling a dual biography. I don't know if I've ever read a dual biography. And then the last one I bought on the strength of, well, not entirely on the strength of the author, but also the subject matter. And that is Absolute Monarchs, History of the Papacy by Lord John Julius Norwich. Norwich is somebody I've read before. He has I think the original book is 3-volume history of the Byzantine Empire. I have the condensed 1-volume history of the Byzantine Empire by him. I think it's just called Byzantium. But the Eastern Roman Empire, which survives the 5th century. He wrote a magisterial work on that. I think it's kind of I think it remains essentially the history of the Byzantine Empire. I think everybody who's writing now sort of has to cite John Julius Norwich. Whether to say, yeah, he got it right, or to disagree with him, they still have to cite him. There he is. Look at that guy. What a dude. Yeah, I think he's passed now, unfortunately. But the papacy is something that's always fascinated me. Um, both because, as a Christian, I'm not a Roman Catholic, and so there's like do I have to listen to the Pope? Probably not, but, worth asking the question. But then also because, today the Pope is like sort of this feel-good mascot for Christianity, especially if you're not a Roman Catholic. It's just kind of a feel-good mascot, and you're kind of like, yeah, he did a great job, when he says something that we agree with. And then when he says things we don't agree with, we're like, yeah, we don't have to listen to that guy. So there's that, but then that also is paired with the fact that there are, popes in the Renaissance, for instance, who are part of Renaissance crime families. One of the Borgias became pope, and it's just that the Borgias are essentially the original mafia. So that's something. But then there are also popes who went out armored and fought battles in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. So there's a lot going on there, and prior to that, there are like early church popes who, were martyred for the faith and died in the flames of martyrdom, So there's just like a whole swath of really interesting kinds of people who have been the pope. And so I'm interested to just learn, because I really don't know that much about the papacy. Um, Pieces here and there, but certainly not a well fleshed out understanding of the whole kit and caboodle. So, looking forward to reading that. I have a chart which I'll throw on the screen here real quickly. So, behold the chart. So that is my shop the shelf progress. You can see there's a nice dip down from 745 to 722, and then with the books that I got for free last week and these books that I have as a result of a gift card, I'm back up to 734. So you may begin because of this to understand why I have the problem that I have. But as I said before, it's a good problem to have. Having good books to read is a great problem to have. I do intend to, draw it down, and I am drawing it down. Still being very ruthless, still not spending my own money on books, but c'est la vie. So I think probably in the future, I will just continue having a chart, just throw it up at the end of every video or near the end of every video, or maybe at the beginning if it makes sense, just to be like, here we are at whatever. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe that will never make an appearance ever again. I don't know. We'll find out. But that's all I've got today. So we'll see you next time.